The title of today's presentation is What is Hinduism? And its subtitle, Let Me Count the Ways. Now let me share a secret with you. When I started counting these ways, I began to get confused, justifying at least one definition of Hinduism, offered, I hope, tongue-in-cheek, that Hinduism is a confused state of mind. Then I exclaimed twice in frustration. The first exclamation went, "What is Hinduism all about?" And the second, "What is Hinduism after all?" And these could serve as optional titles for today's talk. You will notice that although these two titles cover more or less the same ground, the latter title, What is Hinduism after all, has a slight emotional edge to it. What is Hinduism after all? It conveys a hint of frustration with all the fuss about defining Hinduism, which has led some to propose defining Hinduism as indefinable. A touch of mysticism here, defining Hinduism as indefinable at the one end, and as leading to the conclusion that there is no such thing as Hinduism because no such thing can be defined on the other. A touch of skepticism here. Now this last view reflects a confusion between the definition and the thing which the definition sets out to define. A thing may be difficult to define, but that need not mean that the thing does not exist. It may only be just that, difficult to define. Let me now move to the more cerebral version of the title, namely, what is Hinduism all about? As what it is all about may provide a clue as to why it is so hard to pin down, as it were. In fact, the proper title for the talk came to me after the talk had been advertised. Asked today, I would have entitled my talk as The Horizon of Hinduism. You might find some justification for this as I proceed. At this point, I would only draw your attention to a peculiar feature of the horizon. The horizon surrounds us as the background and the context within which all particular events occur. Yet, we never directly touch the horizon. Hinduism does seem to share this elusive quality. I wish to start out by claiming that I am not going to address the topic today. Or rather, I should correct myself. I am going to address the topic today without presuppositions. What I mean by saying so is that I shall not discuss what people have said Hinduism is all about. I shall try to tell you what it seems to me to be all about. Similarly, I do not presuppose any existing knowledge of the details of Hinduism on the part of the audience, only a wish to understand what it is. I shall now proceed to make a very general statement that it is difficult to define any religious tradition, not just Hinduism. And this for at least two reasons. The first is that every tradition possesses a quality which exceeds its contents. This statement is so important that I would like to repeat it. Every tradition possesses a quality which exceeds its contents. Do consider this for a moment. Were a tradition exhausted by its existing contents, no change within it would be possible. But all traditions change over time. All traditions have changed over time. Of course, change can go in two directions. It could be change for better or for worse, unless the change makes no difference, a possible but unlikely outcome. So change can be for better or for worse. When it is for better, we call it progress, and when it is for worse, we call it decline or regress. But whether it is for better or for worse, it carries the implication that each tradition carries within it an unexhausted potential, in the absence of which no change would be possible. Or, to put the matter less philosophically and more directly, religious traditions are not static. And this fact implies that a tradition possesses a quality which exceeds its contents. So this is true of every living tradition. One tends to miss this point, as religious traditions often present themselves as a complete whole to us. I do not wish to deny that they may also be open to further development, hence open and yet complete, and thus complete without being exhaustive. In fact, if they had been exhaustive, they would soon become exhausted. I would like to reiterate that this holds true of all religious traditions, and of course, Hinduism, that it also contains a quality which is not exhausted by its contents, as found in the past or in the present. This then is characteristic of all traditions, or this then is a characteristic of all traditions when viewed in terms of time. When viewed in terms of space, they again reveal a similar and shared feature, that they are all characterized by internal diversity. Even the most formally definable religion, which is how some might wish to characterize Islam, displays enormous internal vitality and diversity. I include here both the formal and the informal diversity which characterizes major world religions. Since I invoked Islam earlier, let me stay with it. Islam recognizes a major division within itself between the Sunnis and the Shi'is, and also 4 and even 5 major schools of the Sharia or Islamic law, and so on. Yet, beyond that, scholars and general observers alike have noticed a difference, if not formally, then in the tone, or should I say inflection, of the religion as it is practiced in Saudi Arabia, Iran, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and here in the West. Similarly, Christianity recognizes 3 basic subdivisions within itself: the Catholic, the Protestant, and the Eastern Orthodox. Just to give you an idea of how major these differences within a tradition can be, let me share with you the fact that in Indonesia, Catholicism and Protestantism are treated as 2 separate religions. The same is the case with China. Both the Chinese and the Indonesian governments treat them as 2 distinct religions, as also some websites dealing with religion. The point cuts deeper than may be apparent at first sight. Sociologists have argued that people within the same religious tradition may have different perspectives on it. Same religious tradition, but different perspectives on it. Thus, even within Protestantism, the Episcopalian may have a very different perspective on it than a Baptist. Lest this point appear remote, consider this. The inability to find a place at the inn in Bethlehem by the parents of Jesus may possess a somewhat different, and dare I say, deeper meaning for a black Christian inured to such an experience in white society than to a white Christian, although both may be participating in the same depiction of the nativity of Jesus. In plain words, then, not only are religious traditions not static, they are also not monolithic. And for similar reasons. Not only does a tradition possess a quality which exceeds its content, it also possesses horizons of meaning which exceed its present content. Now at this point, I can see you getting ready to join issue with me. You did not come here to hear a lecture on comparative religion. You came here to hear a lecture on Hinduism, or more precisely, what it is all about. So let me then share with you the adage current in the study of religion, which might palliate us somewhat. That Hinduism is to India what comparative religion is to the world. Hinduism is to India what comparative religion is to the world. This is, of course, a proposition pregnant with many meanings, but the interpretation I would like to draw from it at the moment is this: that these descriptions of all religions, that they are not static and not monolithic, apply to Hinduism with special force. There is a marked difference of degree. Both are present in what we refer to usually as Hinduism to a much greater extent and degree than in other religions. In fact, let me alert you that in the end I shall be claiming that this difference of degree in respect to Hinduism, in these two respects of not being static and not being monolithic, is such that a difference of degree ultimately leads to a difference in kind, placing Hinduism in a class by itself. It is one of the principles of Marxist theory that a change in quantity ultimately leads to a change in quality. If you apply a certain quantity of heat to water, it makes it boil. But if you go on raising the temperature, water eventually evaporates. What was liquid becomes vapor or gas. This is how a change in quantity can lead to a change in quality. It is also inherent in the phenomenological claim that the scale creates the phenomenon. But I digress. Thus, Hinduism is not static, just as no religious tradition is. Let me now elaborate on this point, how this point applies to Hinduism with greater force than to many other religions. Most of the religions of the world have an identifiable founder or founders. This is not the case with Hinduism. Its origins, to use an expression so loved by the authors of textbooks on it, its origins are shrouded in the mists of antiquity. Thus, while in the case of other religions, we may be able to establish a determinate point when they came into being and then began to change, such a point seems to elude us in the case of Hinduism. The fact that it is called Sanatana Dharma in India seems to confirm this. The word Sanatana means eternal. It can also mean immemorial. But on either reading, the origins of Hinduism remain shrouded in mist, or, if you prefer, mystery. Even if one insists that Hinduism starts with the Vedas, such a point, though now definite, yet remains undetermined. Even according to this view, we do not know when they came into being, only by when they had come into being, that is around 1200 BC. Moreover, according to the Hindu tradition, the origin of the Vedas themselves remains cosmologically indeterminate. So Hinduism is not monolithic either. Hinduism is not static, and Hinduism is not monolithic either. Its social and sectarian divisions border on the scandalous. Allow me to illustrate this point with an anecdote. Not because I wish to use an anecdote as a substitute for analysis, but to lighten the burden of our theme. It is said that once a Muslim got trapped on the wrong side of the religious divide during a day of communal tension in Benares, or Varanasi as it is now called. Finding himself trapped among Hindus, he thought it prudent to pass himself off as one. But the crowd which hemmed him in had its doubts, so they began to interrogate him. "Are you a Hindu or a Muslim?" he was asked. "I am a Hindu," he replied. "Which Hindu?" they asked. Which, that is, what kind of a Hindu? He paused for a moment and then said, "A Brahman. I have just taken my holy bath in the Ganges." But the crowd was not impressed. "Which Brahman?" they demanded to know. He paused again, but still had his wits about him, although a bit shaking. "God Brahman," he replied with satisfaction. God Brahmans, as you might well know, constitute a well-known subdivision among Brahmins. "Which God?" came the next question. At this point, the poor fellow gave up. He could not negotiate the internal divisions of the Hindu community any further and exclaimed, "Ya Allah." Are there even further subdivisions among them? And of course, each subdivision has its own perspective upon the tradition. Let us now pause to take stock of the argument so far. We have argued that no religious tradition is static or monolithic. In other words, that it is characterized by historical transformation and internal diversity. We have further argued that these features get particularly accentuated when we come to Hinduism. But where does this leave us? Have we not drifted away from the main theme and gone off on a perhaps interesting, but otherwise useless and even misleading excursion from the main theme? I would now like to make 3 points, which I hope will demonstrate that the exercise we just carried out may not have been in vain. 1. The fact that religions are neither monolithic nor static makes it harder to arrive at a definition of any religious tradition than would otherwise be the case. It is this fact about a religious tradition which, even in the case of such a self-conscious tradition as Islam, poses problems, as in the case of the Ahmadiyyas, or if you listen to yesterday's reports, even Shiis in relationship to Sunnis. If this was the first point, then the second point is the following: that while in the case of religions which possess a conscious self-definition, such as the Shahada in Islam or the three refuges in Buddhism, these differences arise in spite of their firm self-definition. In Hinduism, these differences arise on account of what Hinduism sets out to be, and not in spite of it. A point to be elaborated later. The third point comes into focus if we ask the fundamental question: why do historical change and internal diversity pose problems for defining a tradition? They pose problems because the definition has to have a unity to it. It is meant to unify the diverse elements contained in what is to be defined in some way, so that the greater the measure of change and diversity, the more formidable the challenge it poses to such a unitary statement presupposed by a definition. Now you can see how the problem of defining any religion helps to clarify the difficulty in defining Hinduism and why it is so difficult to define Hinduism. It is difficult to define because it is non-exclusive. A definition requires delimitation and exclusion. To define something as something means that it must be other than some other thing. Hinduism, however, typically feels unhappy in such situations. Allow me to share with you three displays of such non-exclusivism from within it. First, excuse me, Swami Chandrasekharendra Saraswati, the famous pontiff of Kanchi, also known as Paramacharya, who passed away a few years ago, was approached by a Christian with the request that the Swami allow him to convert to Hinduism. The Swami asked him, "Have you tried Christianity?" An example of the secular uses of Hindu non-exclusiveness comes from Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. When John Foster Dulles, the US Secretary of State at the time, asked him, "Are you for us or against us?" A very American question, you will grant. Are you for us or against us? Pandit Nehru replied, "Yes." Those things we approve of, we are with you. Those we oppose, we are not with you. When Rabbi Richard Rubinstein began feeling confined and uncomfortable by what he had come to feel was a narrow interpretation of Jewish identity in which he had been nurtured, he sought an interview with Swami Muktanand to clarify his situation. No sooner had Swami Muktanand met Rabbi Rubinstein that he remarked, "I hope you don't believe in your religion. I don't believe in mine." I would now like to revert to the 3 points mentioned earlier. The first was that the problem of defining any religious tradition may shed light on the case of Hinduism, and it does. These problems arise because no religious tradition is static or monolithic. But Hinduism, on account of being non-exclusive, does not feel the need to somehow control or contain its historical development and internal diversity, because the tradition itself consists of these features as they manifest themselves. It is not concerned so much with maintaining the boundaries of these phenomena as they manifest themselves, as with the phenomena themselves. The second point related to the question of whether differences are seen as arising out of a self-definition or in spite of them. One could now argue that these differences are part of Hinduism on account of what it sets out to be. I am distinguishing here between the Hindu community as such and Hinduism as the totality of its beliefs and practices. Just as one might distinguish a tree as a concept from an actual tree standing in the garden. The clarifying question to ask is, what is this underlying concept of Hinduism all about? When we ask what Hinduism is all about. And my conclusion is that the following concept underlies the phenomenon which the term Hinduism refers to. Hinduism as a religion derives its rationale, its justification, from trying to afford to every Hindu the maximum access to all the beliefs and practices of the globe from which a Hindu might potentially benefit. I would like to emphasize the word all, and further that this all applies to both beliefs and practices. Notice though that beliefs are more easily assimilated than practices, and practices more easily assimilated than communities. Why? Because ideas cannot be confined. They belong to mental consciousness, which is subtle, while practices often have an embodied character and involve a physical consciousness immediately less accessible than the mental. As a Hindu, I may accept Jesus as the savior right away, but as a vegetarian and a teetotaler Hindu, on my part, it may take some getting used to the Eucharist or the Mass with all its talk about the wine and the blood. This is why the assimilation of practices may lag behind that of beliefs, and the assimilation of communities may lag behind both beliefs and practices. The case of the goddess Chandi provides an interesting example here. The fierce Chandi had already been absorbed into the Hindu pantheon by the early years of the Christian era. But its fierce worshippers, the Chandalas, are still, it seems, in the process of being absorbed. But Hinduism's goal may even be more all-embracing than what I proposed originally. It may want to render accessible all the beliefs and practices which might be of use, and may want to render them, and all of them accessible to all, just as it wants to do so to the Hindu community. But obviously, those who want to exclude themselves from the Hindu community cannot be forced to belong to it. Thus, its non-exclusive thrust is most obvious in the realm of ideas and doctrines, less so in that of practices, and least in the case of communities. But these differences represent different manifestations of the same underlying thrust. This brings us to the third point mentioned earlier. Why should historical change and internal variety pose a challenge to the self-definition of a religious tradition? They pose a challenge because religious traditions typically define themselves in terms of criteria external to them. Historical change and diversity. But Hinduism freely defines itself in terms of these changes and such diversities. Mind you, it does face the challenge of managing these changes and diversities. And the problems of managing these changes and diversities are formidable. But this issue of management must be kept distinct from Hinduism's prior self-definition in terms of the accumulation of these changes and differences, thus justifying its self-description as a cumulative tradition, another connotation of the word Sanatana. The objection may be raised at this point that while the attempt to define Hinduism in terms of non-exclusivity is not vacuous, nevertheless, such a mode of definition seems negative in character, inasmuch as it tells us what Hinduism does not do, is loath to do, namely exclude. It does not tell us, at least as clearly, what it likes to do and why. Moreover, it assumes that there is already a Hindu community in existence which does not exclude others. Others, of course, may exclude themselves from it. Even elements once deemed part of it may begin to exclude themselves. Raja Ranjit Singh, the famous Sikh king of the Punjab, attended the Kumbh Mela held in the early decades of the 19th century, suggesting that the Sikh community did not seek to distance itself, I beg your pardon, from the Hindu in the same way then as it is attempting to now. Thus, communitarian fission as well as fusion characterize the process. An example of fusion is provided by the Shaiv tradition of South India, about which some scholars have argued that it looked upon itself as distinct from the Hindu in medieval times, but no more. I will now propose, on the basis of the hints already dropped, that this negative principle of non-exclusion may be viewed as a positive principle of inclusion in the context of Hinduism. To create room for such a move, however, I would like to invoke some metaphors, 4 metaphors to be precise. Let the first metaphor be that of a tree. A tree symbolizes organic growth and the fact that although its various branches and foliage are connected to the same trunk, they are of different shapes and sizes. But the sap, not visible to the naked eye, which runs through them, is the same. Similarly, parts of it may be connected only indirectly. The branch at one end of the tree is connected to a branch at the other end, but through the trunk. Those religions which are bound together by set beliefs and practices are like a bundle of twigs held together by a rope. By contrast, there is no such visible rope holding the tree together. The tree can keep growing. Note that Hinduism does not possess a fixed and closed canon. Hinduism then is more like a tree than a bundle of branches or twigs, held together artificially in a sense, and more like a banyan tree at that. The metaphor of a tree is helpful in another way. The famous Islamic mystic Rumi points out that one has to search through many leaves to get to the fruit of the tree. And perhaps to get the fruits of Hinduism may take some doing. But let us hope that when we get it, the fruit is not a forbidden one, as some have urged. Let the second metaphor be that of an encyclopedia. An encyclopedia sets out by intention to be comprehensive and to reflect the current state of the art. It has no preferences. It includes all items without judgment and describes them without judgment. It may offer judgments by various scholars and but itself describes them without judgment. And it may offer judgments by various scholars or points of view, from various points of view, but it never delivers an exclusive judgment. It appears in successive editions which try to keep abreast of new developments. Similarly, Hindu identity is not a thing. It is a process, an encyclopedic process. Religions with clearly laid down doctrines and practices are like textbooks, easier to read and understand. An encyclopedia, by comparison, is more comprehensive and rich in information. richer in information. But one must know how to consult it. Hinduism is more like an encyclopedia than a textbook. It's like an encyclopedia without being organized in that way. Of course, in some ways, Hinduism is not like an encyclopedia. Encyclopedias do not strive to integrate, although encyclopedic entries may attempt such an integration. As such, an encyclopedia is only a partial answer to the problem of compartmentalization. But Hinduism strives to integrate while also seeking to be not only adequate, but if possible abundant, embracing both infinity and infinitesimality. And encyclopedias are informational rather than transformational, whereas Hinduism ultimately aims at transformation. The third metaphor is of the contrast between an enclosure and a field. An enclosure has a clearly defined perimeter and a select point of entrance and exit. Those within it have a greater sense of distinction from those outside. By contrast, although a field may also have a point of some kind to let people in, people can often enter the field in other ways, or even just wander in. A field may have its limits. It may fade away into a different terrain, but often it is the other party's fence which constitutes its boundaries. This puts the finger on one big problem in defining Hinduism. It is affected by how others define themselves. In this sense, Hinduism is more like a field one might enter through any point, while other religions are more like an enclosure with a gate. The fourth metaphor is that of a circumference and the center. A center and a circumference can be related in two ways, unless, of course, one draws them simultaneously. One may first have a center and then draw a circumference around it. This represents the case of religions like Islam and Christianity, in which set doctrines and practices constitute the center, around which the followers form a circumference. Hinduism, by contrast, starts out with the circumference, with the people who claim to belong to it, and may then try to identify the center. Religions such as Christianity and Islam expand in concentric circles. A religion like Hinduism too expands, but it expands first, and the contours of the new circumference determine the new center, or even centers. It can also be polycentric, with shifting or at least undulating circumferences, depending on how one might wish to round off the circle. The metaphors chosen above by me might sound arbitrary, but may I propose that their choice is random rather than arbitrary. For instance, the metaphor of the tree may be connected with the Ashwatha tree, sacred already in Harappan times and mentioned in the Katha Upanishad and the Bhagavad Gita. The metaphor of the encyclopedia may be connected with the epic Mahabharata, which is quite explicit about its own encyclopedic intentionality. The idea of a field is latent in the very first word of the first verse of the Bhagavad Gita, Dharma Kshetre Kurukshetra. And the idea of the circle can be connected with the swastika sign which it represents, and which is found in all the three religions which constitute the Indic religious tradition: Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. It also reminds one of a Christian hymn, "May the circle remain unbroken." We have progressed from a negative to a positive statement of the Hindu phenomenon, from non-exclusiveness to inclusiveness. The argument can, however, be further refined by pointing out that the word inclusiveness might carry with it a patronizing air or indicate a kind of missionary zeal to absorb others. But the fact that Hinduism wishes to incorporate others as far as possible without subsuming them in any way enables us to move beyond the word inclusivism to pluralism, remembering all the while that such pluralism pertains to the area of both doctrines and practices, as well as communities. Moreover, it excludes nothing from the past. Hinduism has no founder, or from the future. Hinduism's canon has never been formally closed. And in the present, while others may exclude themselves from it, it is not predisposed to exclude anyone. People may pray apart from each other, or they may come together to do so. Even when they come together to do so, they can do so in two ways. They may come together to pray, that is, retaining their identities, or come to pray together, dissolving them. Hinduism is open to all of these possibilities. A universal religion must provide room for sectarian differences as well as for rising above sectarian differences. But why is Hinduism non-exclusive or inclusive or pluralistic? Is it for some superficial reason, such as indifference or lethargy or ennui? I would like to think that the reason is profound rather than superficial. No definition of Hinduism can be final because within it, no religious or philosophical practice or point of view can be final. No definition of Hinduism can be final because within it, no religious or philosophical practice or point of view can be final, including this one. This is where it probably goes beyond Buddhism, which is said to assert that the absolute truth is that there is no absolute truth. But back to Hinduism. The Hindu view that no position within it can be final, including this one, has two important implications for the present context. The philosophical implication is that as no philosophical position can be final, including this one, its pluralism allows room for absolutism within it. The philosophical implication is that as no philosophical position can be final, including this one, its pluralism allows room for absolutism within it, and thus room for exclusivistic sects, such as forms of Vaishnavism, and even for claims to philosophical supremacy, such as the one made sometimes on behalf of Advaita Vedanta. Yet, such absolutism within it is a result of its own self-relativization. Whereas the absolutism of the Abrahamic religions, and I have especially Christianity and Islam in mind here, involves the relativization of others. Or, to put it another way, even its intolerance implied in absolutism, even its intolerance is an expression of its tolerance. While even the tolerance displayed by many forms of Christianity and Islam is a kind of intolerance which accepts other religions only as preparing the way for them, paving the way for their arrival into the Christian or the Islamic fold. Other religions insist on making themselves the criterion. Hinduism is willing to be a sample along with them. Sociologically, this point that no position can be final, including that, has even profounder consequences. For what this means is that since each individual member may follow one or more religion, what we call religion, periodically or even at the same time, Hinduism can properly only be defined in terms of the people who are willing in principle to allow people in general to follow more than one religion at a time. To allow those who are outside their own circle or themselves. Note that the possibility of adhering to only one religion or a sect is on one's part is included in multiple religious participation. You can also have single religion participation. What becomes crucial then is to be willing to be part of a religious world or community in which one freely allows this option to others, even if when one is not exercising it oneself. You can be a member of a Vaishnava sect, but if you allow others the privilege of multiple religious participation, you are a Hindu along with them. Now we are ready to discuss what Hinduism is all about. Hinduism is about providing every human being with access to all the possible modes of engaging the divine, which human beings have come up with or will ever come up with, and about offering as complete and comprehensive a freedom of choice as is humanly and, shall we say, divinely possible in doing so. This constitutes, for me, the goal, the telos, the inner drive of Hinduism. In other words, to find out what Hinduism is, we have to graduate beyond such words as non-exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism to universalism. Such universalism of Hinduism possesses two dimensions: to make all possible religious modalities accessible to all. Even as a portion for Buddhist vocabulary, what we have here may be called sarva yan. Or in secular English usage, all in all. The first all standing for the techniques and the second for the people. Hinduism is also, however, a process of transforming all into whole to the extent it might be possible, or to phrase it in Hindu terms, of making sarva into Vishwa. Now the question arises, if Hinduism is identical with such universalism, then why have Hinduism? Why not universalism? The answer to this question runs as follows. While there may be a universal religion, it will not be found in a form which is universal. For then it would become uniform and cease to be universal in the genuine sense of the term, as containing rather than eliminating difference. Think of Krishna's epiphany in the 11th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, if you will, at this point. Everything is contained in this vision which Arjuna has. Nothing is flattened out. Secondly, when we speak of universalism, we tend to think of it as a noun. Moreover, we tend to think of it as an abstract noun. However, let us try to think of it as a verb, as something dynamic. Hinduism then becomes not a universal fact, but a universalizing process. So although Hinduism and universalism are closely allied, the implicit self-understanding of Hinduism as a universalizing process keeps it distinct. That is why Hinduism does not speak of the world becoming Hindu so much as of a Hindu world. That is why the goal of a Chakravartin, a world conqueror in Hinduism, is not to establish, rather is to establish Hindu rule and not establish Hinduism all over the world. Now we come to the subtlest point of all. In my view, or rather it is my view, that Hinduism involves a twofold universalizing process. It tries to offer salvation to all on their own terms, wherever they happen to find themselves, even as it also tries to make all doctrines and practices available to them, just where they are. But at the same time, it also tries to improve the material and spiritual situation in which they find themselves. And it also tries to raise the empirical flow, even as it lifts one up to the spiritual ceiling. God, it is said, cares more for the adverb than the verb. God cares more for the adverb than the verb, cares more for the verb than the noun, and cares more for the intransitive than the transitive noun. We are now ready to advance to a point of surprising subtlety. So far as salvation or liberation or moksha is concerned, it seems to be an axiomatic assumption of Hinduism that one is free to choose freedom, that one is always free to choose freedom at any time one so chooses. Any empirical situation, no matter how bad or even evil, can provide the liftoff for salvation or emancipation or moksha. But a point of even, let me insert an example here. It is like saying that one can travel to the moon from any given point on the earth in principle, even if it be in the middle of the ocean, in principle. By contrast, each exclusive religion thinks of itself as the Cape Canaveral, or now Cape Kennedy of rocket travel to the moon. But a point of even further subtlety is involved, and I run the risk of being misunderstood in making it. And I think you are going to take me up on this in the question hour. Hinduism is often accused of being a religion of the status quo. But the statement is true in a sense not intended by those who make it. Hinduism does claim that whatever your status, even status quo in life, you can reach out to the divine from there, for one is always free to choose freedom. All of life can really be yoga, in other words. It is for this reason and no other that fact and norm, description and idealization, statement and appeal sometimes seem inseparable in Hindu religious discourse. It does not say, however, that your status should be left as it is. your lot not improved. The Vaisheshika Sutra of Kanad famously defines dharma as that which enables one to rise in the world, abhyudaya, and that which enables one to attain salvation or liberation, nishreyasa. I now wish to conclude, and for a lecture this long, and thanks for your patience, the conclusion is going to be refreshingly brief. What is Hinduism after all? It is dharma. Dharma is what? That which makes a thing what it is. It constitutes the law of its being. And I have tried to lay out before you what I think we have called Hinduism makes Hinduism what it is. But no European language, I am told, has succeeded in translating the word dharma successfully with a single synonym. Perhaps because the word contains a world within itself, the Hindu world, as it were. The difficulty other languages and cultures have in translating this word dharma, and you might be surprised to know that even the Greeks had a problem with it. In translating it in all the senses of the term, seems to suggest that the semantic swath it cuts is so uniquely Hindu as to make one feel secure in the belief that the word may indeed be used to define Hinduism. Although you might claim that all I have accomplished in the course of this long lecture is in the end to translate one indefinable word with another indefinable word. Please note though that while we may define Hinduism as dharma, we may not define dharma as Hinduism. A telling asymmetry comes into play here. It is all right to translate Hinduism as dharma, but if dharma is translated as Hinduism, there is the danger of much being lost, as is often said these days, one hears said these days, of much being lost in translation. There is even a grave danger, some would argue, of even an entire religious tradition and its raison d'etre, and of the perspective of its perspective on religion itself may be in danger of getting lost in translation. I would like to conclude with that. Thank you all.